טוב, במושב הזה יש לנו שני אנשים, איבדו אותנו בהיענותם להזמנה מאוד חשובים, וגם יהיה מאוד מעניין לשמוע אותם, כל אחד מזווית הראייה שלו. תחילה אנחנו נשמע את פרופסור אנטוני בריק, ברייק, כן, שיותר ידבר על שיקום מערכתי של בתי הספר, ואני רוצה בהזדמנות זו גם לנסות ולהעלות מספר קושיות בהקשר של שיקום מערכתי ובכלל פיתוח מערכתי של בתי ספר, כאשר השאלה המרכזית שאני רוצה להציב אותה היא למעשה מהי המשמעות הפרקטית של שיפור מערכתי של בתי הספר, וכיצד שיפור מערכתי כזה בא לידי ביטוי בין כותלי הכיתה, זאת אומרת בין הקשר בין התלמיד לבין המורה בתוך הכיתה. שיפור מערכתי יכול להיות ברמה של בית ספר, והאם ניתן בכלל לעשות שיפור מערכתי של בתי ספר בנפרד. ברוכה הבאה, בוקר טוב. את מוזמנת ישר לעלות. אבל בכל זאת אני פתחתי ואמרתי, אנחנו תקבלים בברכה את בערך. אבל בכל זאת הקדמתי שהאורח שלנו הוא יהיה הראשון הפותח, ולכן אני רוצה שוב לחזור לגבי שתי שאלות או שתי קישויות שעומדות לדיון, ואני לא יודע אם אני מקווה שהאורח שלנו גם מתייחס אליהם. אחד, מהי למעשה הפרקטיקה, המשמעות הפרקטית של שיפור מערכתי של בתי הספר, לקשר בין מורה תלמיד בתוך הכיתה, והאם ניתן בכלל לעשות שיפור מערכתי של בתי הספר ברמה הבית ספרית, או שיפור מערכתי כוללני של הסביבה שבה נמצא בית הספר. אני מזמין תחילה את פרופסור אנטוני בריק, President of Carnegie Foundation of the Advancement of Teaching in the United States. Please.
Good morning. Thank you. It's truly an honor to be here and to have this opportunity to share with you some of the work that I and the Foundation have been engaged in and hope to be engaged in literally for the decade ahead. Let me begin with some perspective. We live in extraordinary times. When I think about the current system of education, at least as we've known it in the United States, it came into existence largely the turn into the 20th century. It was created amidst an extraordinary set of forces. Economic, as we shifted from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy. Cultural, as in the United States, we witnessed enormous immigration, and the emergence of our cities, immigration. In the midst of those economic and social forces, we created the education system in the United States that we know, and that looks quite similar, actually, to educational systems in many other countries. I would argue that now we are again in one of these extraordinary historic moments, where economic, social, and technological forces are converging again, and we are about the process of creating a new set of educational systems. The movement from an industrial economy to a knowledge economy. Immigration, which is occurring not only in our country but in many other countries. And this wave of technology that is transforming how we live and learn and will surely transform how we educate. This is a time where we're not talking about new programs on the margins, but literally the reinvention of schooling as an institution. And I think as we look back on this period 10 years from now, this is what we will see. At base behind all of this is a new goal for our educational systems, framed differently by different individuals, but captured in this idea, ambitious academic attainment for all students. What historically we've asked for a small portion of our society, we now seek for all of our children. Obviously, a strong base in basic knowledge, cultural knowledge, and academic skills, but much more. The capacity to apply knowledge to complex problems. Social communication skills, working with diverse others in a global society. The use of new technologies to inquire, to learn, to represent, to communicate. And, not to be forgotten, the development of those habits and minds and heart. The ease with which we engage in activity. Persistence in the face of failure, and tenacity in the pursuit of worthy goals. These are the dispositions to innovate in a knowledge economy. So, as we think about the work ahead, it's ambitious learning for all students, but I would argue this is only half of the problem of improvement we confront. The other, again, at least in the United States context, when we think about the improvement of public education, we exist in an environment where there is fierce competition for public resources. No matter how important we think education is to the future of our society, we stand in competition with other equally important social goods. And so that while we're pushing the system towards much more ambitious outcomes for all students, we also have to accomplish this with much greater efficiency than ever before. And these twin goals, much more ambitious outcomes for all, and a system that's much more efficient, is what really frames the problem of improvement over the next decade. So I would argue a pressing need comes into focus. It's inconceivable, I would argue, that we could have much better educational outcomes without a serious renewal of the ways in which we support the development of teachers and the tools, materials, ideas with which they work, and the institutional arrangements within which their work occurs. When you think about this problem, you would naturally think about research and development as a powerful assist to solving these problems. But our current research and development infrastructure for the improvement of schooling is very weak. It's not, however, for a lack of energy and activity. We have many researchers in the academy who are off developing new concepts and ideas about education. Practitioners every day are innovating in their classrooms and schools, attempting new ways to organize instruction and learning. So there's an enormous array of activity occurring in the field already on efforts to improve. But it's disorganized, it's fragmented, and it doesn't accumulate. And even as individuals learn things that are very valuable, what they learn often lives and dies with them. We simply don't have a system that actually promotes improvement and sustained learning over time. This, I would argue, is the problem, the big problem we have to solve if policy is going to actually result in sustained improvements in student learning. All of this work that's occurring in research and practice, all of it exists right now within a very entropic environment. Lots of forces, but all pushing in different directions. Government, local institutions, research in the academy, as well as the work of various non-governmental organizations. So what I'm arguing is that we need a renewed research and development infrastructure to support the improvement of schooling. And that infrastructure I call design, educational engineering, and development. It's a different form of inquiry than we're accustomed to undertaking in education. And I would argue it also requires a new set of organizational form to support it. Three themes in this design, educational engineering, and development activity and the organization. At its core, the nature of this inquiry that I want to talk about aims to produce a science of performance improvement. It's about very practical matters, and but it intends to bring very rigorous inquiry to bear on the practical matters of improving teaching and learning and the institution which it occurs. If you will, thinking about this as bookends, the work involves building a science of performance improvement, In terms of social organization, it requires generating a field, a capacity, a generative capacity for researchers and practitioners to work together. And I would argue now that we have, through Web 2.0 technology, some real capacity to engage communities of practice, researchers and practitioners, through open educational resources and open learning networks to really advance these kinds of improvements. And sitting in the middle of this is the whole question of where and how we can use technology to add value to teaching and learning. First off, this issue about the aim toward a science of performance improvement. What do I mean by this topic? Well, I mean 5 things. First off, it puts the day-to-day work of teachers, staff developers, school heads at the center of inquiry. The problems of practice that they confront every day are the organizing themes for the inquiry. As straightforward as that sounds, that typically is not the primary organizer for the way research and development is currently done in education. So it puts the problems of practice that must be solved at the center of the inquiry. Second, it probes deeply into these problems of practice. What are the core processes involved? How do these link together? It's important to know the outcomes, that is, what's happening with student learning, but we have to have intense focus on all the processes and how they might interconnect with one another to produce those outcomes. So it's really probing the causal logic of improvement. Third, it assumes that natural variability is the state of affairs. Over 50 years of the history of innovation work in education suggests that almost everything works someplace and virtually nothing works everywhere. Variability is the natural state of affairs. If you want to improve systems at scale, we need to understand those sources of variability, and in particular, if you want to think about the lower tail of the distribution, the less desirable outcomes, those are the ones we wish to remove or reduce. So it assumes that variability exists, and we need to understand the sources of that variability. That in turn has implications for how we inquire, understand the various sources of variability and the effects of different innovations. And our goal, again, if the goal is improvement at scale, then the goal that translates into a continuous improvement goal of achieving reliability and performance. Knowing that something can work is insufficient. We need to know how to make it work with some reliability at scale in the hands of ordinary teachers and in the hands of the conditions, the school context conditions in which teachers work. Something might be ideal is insufficient unless we can take that ideal and actually have it engaged over and over again in many different places. All right, I want to illustrate this idea of a science of performance improvement in the context of a problem of practice improvement that I've been engaged in for a number of years. And it starts with the goal of getting all children to learn to read by the end of grade 3 and develop the disposition to use reading to learn. If we could accomplish one thing as a universal goal, this is the one I would argue we should focus our attention on, because this opens up the opportunities for children, and the failure to accomplish this actually forecloses the opportunities for many of our children going forward. Well, in attacking this problem, what I want to do through this example is detail what I would call the causal cascade that links the intentional design of professional education, how policy might focus on professional education initiatives that actually in turn are intended to provoke changes in instructional practice, and then on to improvements in student learning. How do we track the pieces here to understand how a system might actually produce improvements in student learning at some scale aimed at this problem? All right. The context of this. One of the strategies that's been commonly used in the United States in trying to attack the problem that I've just introduced is to introduce coaches into public school systems. And coaches are school-based staff developers. Typically what they're doing is offering professional development on-site with teachers, often through one-on-one coaching which involves going into a teacher's classroom, observing her practice, and giving some feedback on basis of what he or she has seen. The way this generally works, the district makes a commitment to introduce coaches. The policy issues, well, we have to have salary policies. We have to figure out hiring and assignment issues. We may have to negotiate with the teachers' union around these various issues, so union contracts, and we're going to introduce coaching. The Los Angeles public school system, which is the second largest public school system in the United States, almost 1,000 schools decided to introduce coaching a number of years ago, and inside of 3 weeks, they hired 600 coaches, and a coach was assigned to every elementary school in the system. Well, the assumption is we have coaching now, and that's going to provoke a whole set of improvements in teachers' knowledge and skills, and ultimately that's going to lead to improvements in student learning. That's the rationale. Big investment in professional development, all these changes are supposed to occur. This is what I call the zone of wishful thinking. We have policy, we have outcomes. What has to happen in between the policy and the outcomes so that this policy might actually produce the changes we have in mind? This is an example of the classic black box that exists between policy and the outcomes. If we want the policy to improve the outcomes, we have to understand what has to happen inside here in the black box. Well, as we've begun to parse the activity inside the black box, there are assumptions about a whole set of things that have to happen. How coaches use their time, the actual quality of coaching. Coaching is occurring in a social context of a school, so it depends on the relationship between a coach and a principal. It depends on the relationship between coaches and teachers. It also depends on actually how much coaching each individual teacher gets and in what domains or content areas. So we have to understand these processes, I would argue, if policy is actually to result in reliable improvements at scale. All right, so how would we understand these things? What would be the usable knowledge for managing improvement at scale on an initiative like this? Well, first off, we have to know how coaches are actually spending their time in schools. And as we started to inquire into this, there are standards for how much coaching is supposed to occur, but when we actually look at the practice, basically there's no coaching that occurs in December. Well, why is that? We have lots of special events in our schools, holiday events, and a whole month of the academic year basically disappears for professional development. Well, we've hired these coaches, but rarely what we do is really ask the question, well, what do these coaches really need to know and be able to do? And how do we know whether or not they can do it? Just as we ask these questions about our teachers or we ask these questions about our students, we need to ask these questions about our coaches. We've hired a number of people, we've created a new role, but what is it they need to know and be able to do? And how as a system would we know whether or not they can do it, or even more importantly, that they're developing their expertise and their ability to do it? That's another piece of the information that we need. We know that this occurs in a social context of schools. So what about the relationships in that school context matter? In particular, I would argue that, and we have evidence of this now, that the nature of the trust relationships that work between a coach and a principal and between a coach and the teachers in the school are essential in whether or not this kind of initiative can actually result in changes in teacher practice and student learning. So a whole question about the quality of relational dynamics in the school community. Finally, the question about, well, this is a highly individualized intervention, as by design it should be. But then the question is, well, who's actually receiving coaching? How much? And what kind of topics? And are we actually deploying this scarce resource in the most effective manner? Then we have to move on to the next question. We understand what we think are the core processes involved, core components of this coaching initiative. The most immediate consequence of the coaching should be changes in instructional practice. We can't expect changes in student learning to occur if coaching isn't changing the way teaching is actually being enacted in the classroom? Well, and that immediately raises the question, well, what do we expect to see? What changes in instructional practice? What does it mean for teachers to develop expertise, in this case, in the context of a particular instructional system called comprehensive literacy? How are novice teachers, how is what we see in their classrooms different from what we would expect to see in teachers, in the classrooms of teachers who are expert at these practices? We have to detail this out, because if we don't detail it out, we don't know, we can't tell whether or not all of this deployment of resources for coaching is doing any good in terms of its primary, its immediate impact, which is changes in instruction. So to do this, we had to develop a whole set of observational routines linked directly to the specific instructional system that this coaching was intended to advance, which is I referred to before as comprehensive literacy. This set of observational rubrics are linked to some theory about student literacy learning. What is it that we think is going on in the minds of students as they break the code? Because we need to understand that. We have to have some understanding of what it means for teachers to develop expertise in this instructional system. And the whole set of observations have to be contextualized in terms of the materials, resources, regular routines that one would expect to see in these classrooms. So a tool like this is very useful in helping us to specify what it is we think instruction should look like and what we're aiming for through this coaching activity. The particular tool we built here involves 6 rubrics tied to the 6 basic components of instruction that one would see in comprehensive literacy, including such activities as guided reading, that is a reading group activity, and writer's workshop. Also included in it some holistic rubrics about the basic organization of the classroom and the ways in which teachers orchestrate across the major elements of a comprehensive literacy system to actually advance student learning. My only point in showing this to you is you have to get deeply down into the instructional system to know what to look for. We can't talk about improvement of teaching as a generic quality. That if you really want to manage improvement at scale, you have to specify in some detail what is the teaching that you expect to see. Undergirding all of this is a model of expertise development, as I already mentioned. At the lowest level of expertise development, you're looking at, are the basic organizational routines in place? Is guided reading occurring every day? Are teachers using level text and selecting level text appropriately for the groups in front of them? That's at the most basic level of the practice. As you move toward expertise, what you're really interested in is really the strategic teaching that's occurring within those routines. Is there evidence that what teachers are doing within those routines are connecting to where students are as learners, clear objectives in view as to what we're trying to accomplish in instruction, and real strategic action at linking those things together? That's what distinguishes expert teachers from more novice teachers. Most novice teachers may have a command of the routines, but they do the same thing over and over again, regardless of who's in front of them and regardless of the specific objectives. Where expert teachers are actually intervening in very strategic ways to move learning along. Why is a system like this important? Well, it provides a very concrete language for a professional developer or coach so that practices can be understood and discussed. This language also serves as a guide for teachers to understand the journey they're on as their own development. And these kinds of rubrics can generate data that one can use to manage improvement in an instructional system of this sort. All right, so we talked about having data on teacher practice development. The next piece we're working on right now is really the whole practice of coaching. As I said before, what coaches actually do in schools is a very complex set of activities. But the the high leverage activity is walking into a classroom. And when a coach walks into a classroom, the essential piece of the work, where's the expertise? When you look at a classroom, it's a very complex environment. There's lots to attend to. The essence of the work is, what do you see and what do you say about what you just saw? How do individuals develop expertise around that? And so we're beginning to work on trying to elaborate a whole set of performance assessment tasks, which can be used, formative performance assessment tasks, which can be used to support the development of coaches around the critical piece of work they did. As they walk into a classroom, what do you see and what do you say? Can we reliably assess it? Because we can't reliably assess it, we can't do much about the variability in the quality of coaching itself. We've built surveys for the relational pieces of this, which are highly reliable and which we now have lots of evidence about. And then we've added to this a set of logs, a simple reporting system in terms of how coaches are actually spending their time, who they're working with, and what kinds of professional development each individual teacher is receiving. So we've tried to develop a base of information about this effort to improve instruction. Now we have the next piece to link it to, which is the actual evidence on student learning and whether it's improving over time or not. And here what we're doing is basically what's referred to as a value-added strategy, where what we're trying to associate, what we're trying to do is to assess the value added to student learning occurring in each classroom in school as this professional development occurs. And quite simply, although the statistics of this can get complicated, the idea is basically fairly simple. You establish a baseline of learning in each school, in each classroom. What kind of learning is occurring prior to the introduction of professional development? And then you compare the learning gains in those schools and classrooms over time to that baseline. So each school or classroom is compared to its base. We're not comparing across schools, we're comparing each school to its base, and we're asking the question, how much is each school, how much is each classroom improving as a result of this professional development? Here are the results from one study in 18 schools we're in. These are the value addeds to student learning 1 year into professional development. Let's move it back. All right. I can get to anchor this. A value of 0 means that the learning at these schools 1 year into professional development is exactly the same as it was during their baseline. You notice most of the bars are above 0, which means there was some effect already occurring 1 year into the initiative. To reference the size of these effects, we've scaled the outcomes such that 1.0 was the average learning gain occurring in this set of schools during the base period. So the average effect at the end of year 1 was 0.19, which is quite simply can be interpreted as a 19% improvement in productivity. That is, the learning gains a year later are 19% greater than they were during the base period. We have this data for the first year, the second year, the third year, and this extraordinary amount of information in this about what's happening across these 18 schools over the 3 years. And you notice that we have several schools in here, 9, 10, 14, and 15, where quite significant learning gains on average have occurred. And we also have evidence in here in school 17, which looks like, for example, well, they look pretty reasonable the first year, but the initiative deteriorated, it appears, in terms of student learning by the end of year 3. It's going down, where most of the schools are going up. So immediately it raises the question, what happened in school 9, 10, 14, and 15 that didn't happen in school 17? This is the variability and effects that I was talking about before. This is what we need to understand if we're to get improvements reliably in schools. What happened in a place like school 17? Similarly, we can get this kind of data for each school. We can get this kind of data for each classroom within each school. Here what we're representing is a box plot which shows the variability in the value added to student learning at each classroom in each school, at the end of the first year and at the end of the third year. And quick thing we see, just going back and forth, is that while the box plots are moving up, going from year 1 to year 3, they're also spreading out. So the nature of this kind of intervention is creating more variable performance at the classroom level over time. Why is that? What's creating the increased variability, and what do we do about it? Most teachers are moving up, but we can see in a number of the schools that we have teachers whose value added is actually slightly negative. So why is it that the intervention is not having effects for those subsets of teachers in those subsets of schools? That's the kind of problem we have to identify, we have to ask, and we have to get good answers to. All right. So in order to do that, we have to join these kinds of data to some working theory about practice improvement. Again, what we have here is a situation of we have an intervention in the work of teachers that's supposed to impact student learning. We then have to ask the question, well, we know there's variability by teachers. What do we need to know about the individual teachers that may be contributing to this variability? We know there's variability that's associated with schools and the effects of this intervention. So what is it about the schools that really matter? We have to have some working set of ideas about what we need to know and actually make this system work more reliably. The bottom line here is fairly straightforward. It's hard to improve what you don't deeply understand. And that means we need to elaborate this kind of theory. We need to gather data on it. As you begin to gather data, the theory itself will get better. As the theory gets better, it leads you to better data collection. There's a kind of reciprocity of going back and forth. These are the kinds of understandings we have to develop, and where evidence plays a key role in not only driving decisions, but actually helping us understand the system better over time. All right. 2 minutes? All right. 2 minutes. I'm going to jump. Let me talk quickly about technology. I'm going to skip the issue about harnessing field generative capacity and then go to conclusions. Why do I think technology is a lever for change? When we look at the major ways in which we've tried to improve teaching and learning, there are basically 3 big levers. We can try to enhance the quality and quantity of those who teach and the systems in which they work. So we can really work on our human resources. We can expand instructional time, or we can try to change the core work organization of instruction. Virtually every reform is operating off of one of those 3 big levers. And what I would argue is that technology can provide a really disruptive innovation into each of those. In terms of the quality and quantity of those who teach, we now have a fair amount of experience with efforts to use multimedia, online, and other technological resources to recreate teacher preparation, to support teacher preparation and ongoing professional education. So technology can help with regard to teacher learning. We can also expand the base of human resources that are available to support students through e-mentoring, peer and cross-age networking. Social networking functions that are now readily available over the internet can be an extraordinary resource in this regard. As we move into more project-based work, which becomes more specialized, we can bring much more expertise into the classroom than any individual teacher can hold on his or her own. So technology is a big resource with regard to the first level. Second, technology is potentially a big resource on expanding time. We've been accustomed to thinking about schooling as something that basically occurs between the hours of roughly 9 and 3 o'clock. It occurs in the classroom. It's directed by a teacher. But with technology, much more of this learning can occur outside of the 9 to 3 time. It can occur out in communities, in libraries, in various informal environments. It can also occur across the summer, which is actually increasingly being understood as one of the places where, when we look at gaps in achievement, minority gaps, disadvantaged gaps in achievement, there's a growing body of research that these gaps accumulate across summer periods. Technology can help us to scaffold across that as well. And third, the biggest lever of all, is can we reinvent the organization of schooling in a 24/7 digital environment? Where these things, imagine an environment where these things and these things are as common as paper and pencil, where wireless meshes exist over a whole community and everyone has universal access. How would we do schooling in that kind of context? And we're not very far from that today. Key here, I would argue, is supporting more independent work for students. If we open up that lever, everything inside of schooling then becomes open for change. And we're starting to see this happen already. Particularly at the high school level, we have an extraordinary array now of online courses, project-based activity being supported over the internet, rapid development of cognitive tutors in which support student learning. The key point is that students can be much more individually engaged in their learning. And when that happens, that allows us to re-envision and open up the teacher's role inside of schools. Because as long as we're constrained to the traditional organization of schooling, the egg crate structure, classroom, 25 to 35 students and a teacher, 9 to 3, the ways in which technology can enter are very limited. As soon as you start to break out of that box, you really begin to see enormous different ways in which the work of students and the work of adults can be transformed. Another key thing, and we'll begin to introduce technology into schools, when the work of students and adults is digitally encoded, when we have a digital record of most of the work they do, it opens up a way of totally changing the way we think about assessment. At least formal assessment in the United States is something we add on top of instruction. When most of the work that students do is digitally encoded, the task of instruction gets transformed into one of harnessing the evidence out of the digital record. And so it really opens up the possibilities of much more authentic forms of student assessment than the kinds of standardized assessments in which we tend to rely on in judging schools. All right, I'm going to just jump all the way to the end since I'm afraid we're out of time. To sum up, this is no small plans proposition to actually vitalize an educational engineering and development infrastructure for the improvement of schooling. For this idea, I'm indebted to that famous Chicago architect and urban planner, Daniel Burnham. Make no small plans, for they fail to inspire the hearts of men and women. Such usable knowledge for improvement of schooling must be anchored in problems of practice improvement on the job floor, the day-to-day work of teachers, principals, staff developers. It requires some working theory of practice and its improvement. How do we think these policies are actually going to improve teaching and learning? It's connected to a science of performance improvement where we expect variation in the effects of our interventions and we make that variation an object of study. And that the goal is really trying to focus on reliability and improvement. And in order to do these things, it all has to be anchored in some common instructional system in which we have some shared language about practice and inquiry to improve that practice. So to bring things back and to close my remarks, bring things back to the focus of this conference, which is on the question of policy and its link to implementation. What I'm arguing is key to understanding that link is the issue. It's really about reliable execution at scale. In order to accomplish that, it's about developing a knowledge base to inform us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bryk. I think all of us have to learn more about the models in this area, especially in Israel. נעבור לאורחת השנייה שלנו, לדוברת השנייה, ואני רוצה, לפני שניתן לה את רשות הדיבור, להעלות אולי שתי סוגיות שאני מקווה ומבקש שפרופסור תמיר, חברת הכנסת, פרופסור תמיר, תתייחס אליהם. והסוגיה הראשונה היא, לאחר 24 שעות שאת כבר לא שם, איך את רואה את הדברים? זאת אומרת, האם את רואה את הדברים אחרת? את מסתכלת על דברים אחרת? זו שאלה שבאמת הייתי רוצה, גם בהקשר של של התוכניות ושל הרפורמה ובכלל. ושאלה אחרת, האם קיימת בכלל מדיניות? ואם קיימת מדיניות, מי קובע את המדיניות? מה השיקולים לקביעת המדיניות? פוליטיים, מקצועיים, פוליטיים מקצועיים? וגם שנקבעת מדיניות ולא חשוב מה השיקול של המדיניות הזאת, כיצד היא מתבצעת. זאת אומרת, איפה הבעיה ביישום? אם בכלל קיימת בעיה ביישום. Professor Tamir tell me that she preferred to give us the lecture, her lecture in English language. אוקיי? מה זה איך רוצים? איך שאת רוצה? What you prefer? In English? Okay. Please.
I'll say one thing in Hebrew because I don't know how to translate it. Because the expectation is, so the first question is, how do you feel a few weeks after I left my position is, מה שרואים מפה לא רואים משם. This is the Israeli justification for changing your mind every now and then, or actually very often. So I have this, I think, tendency not to change my mind in this area as well as in others. So I still see things the way I've seen them while I was in the Ministry of Education. And I think that this conference is really an enormous contribution to thinking about school reform. And I should tell you, I'm very happy it happened after I've finished my term, because if I would have been here before, I probably wouldn't have done anything, because it seems so, you look at these charts and you say, well, it couldn't be done. And that's probably part of the problem, because when you try to think about reforming a system, which is very different than reforming a school. Reforming a system has very, very specific features, and I will try to talk about these features because I've liked very much Professor Bryk's presentation. There was, I think, essentially saying there that I think is important to all those who want to make comprehensive changes in education. And it was the sentence that everything works somewhere and nothing works everywhere. Now, the Minister of Education, unlike those who do experiments in education or local education, needs to have a comprehensive view of the system, and also to bear in mind that important saying. Namely, that when you do a reform and then it doesn't work somewhere, it doesn't mean that it's a bad reform. So I think the first thing, and since I came from the academic world, when I came into the ministry, I had, I think, two important, at least important for me, understandings. A, that it's going to be a change that is going to be gradual, with a lot of frustration, as we've seen here a chart on 18 schools, which will deal with over 4,000 schools. Some will do better than others, and although the system is very, very variable, and the Israeli system is extremely, I think, multicultural, multilingual, multi-religious system, so you have to presuppose it's going to work differently in different spheres, in different classes. Nevertheless, you have to have a policy. And it needs to be a national policy, and it needs to have a rationale that deals with national problems. The first issue that you must deal with is asking yourself what the problem is. Now, you may think this is a very simple issue because there are so many problems, and they are evident, and we've heard about them, so I won't repeat them, during the last 2 days. But having too many problems is a problem. And one of the things that happen to ministers of education is that they deal with everything. And if you deal with everything, you deal with nothing. And that's a very hard decision. Because the first thing you have to do is to say to a lot of people who rightly demand that you deal with something, I'm not going to deal with it. Because if I deal with everything, then I won't be able to do something significant. And even when you say that, you deal with everything, but at least you put your emphasis somewhere. So that's question number one. For me, the biggest issue, and I think it ties well to what Professor Bryk said, was allowing children in primary school to graduate primary school with learning skills that will allow them to proceed their learning. It doesn't mean that we don't have a huge problem in middle schools. Maybe this is the weakest point in the system. It doesn't mean that we don't have other problems. But if you don't acquire learning skills at an early age, you won't succeed in school. I think this is something that everyone who deals with education will agree with. Now, the second problem of running a holistic, systematic change is financing. I see here Adi, he's the guy in the Ministry of Education who deals with financing. So I look at him and I remember all our long discussions. Good ideas are not enough. In order to really implement a change, then you have to count numbers. And it is extremely important, and Israel is a small system relatively to the United States or other systems. Nevertheless, let me just give you one example. Israel has 128,000 teachers. Raising their salary in 1%, okay, 1% is totally insignificant for the individual, is 180 million shekels. 10%, and you know how to duplicate, I hope. So you know what it means to say, I want to raise teachers' salaries. Everybody says that. Can you do it? And you can't say, I'll give it only to 5 or 10 or 15 or 500 teachers. So when you start to make a systematic school reform, you are, by definition, more modest than any experiment that is taking place on a small basis. And this is a problem because everybody who did a small experiment in 5 schools and gave them enormous amount of resources tells you that it works. By the way, as you all know, the Horton effect, most experiments in education work. So they come to you and say, look, there is a wonderful experiment. Why don't you take it? And you say, well, honestly, you know, if I take it for the basis of a school reform, it will cost amounts that are really the kind of money I can't get for the system at large. And I don't want to stop at 5 or 15 or 500 schools. So you have to be relatively modest, and this is a problem, especially for politicians, because they have to publicly explain what they're doing, rather than academics who just have to express their views. So here you have to go through a public process of explaining what you're doing and why you're doing what everybody thinks to begin with, even before you started, is not enough. By the way, most politicians, since they understand very little about education, but very easily talk about education because their children went to school or because they once visited the school. You know, the thing about education is that everybody is an expert. Will challenge you in the parliamentary debates about how much they would have given if they would have done the same thing. And I'll talk in a moment about the school reform here that I did together with the Ishtadrut HaMorim, and Yossi Wasserman is here. And teacher salaries were raised due to the reform by 40%, and nevertheless, there were many, many people in the political world who said, 40%? Why not 60? Why not 100? Now, it's true that teacher salaries in Israel are very low, but we have added 5 billion shekels to the Ministry of Education budget in order to pay mostly for teachers' salaries. I'll talk about it in a moment why I thought it was important. But money counts, and without it, it's very hard to make a difference. This also means that you have to go to the sort of unpleasant experience of convincing your Ministry of Finance that what you do is the right thing to do, and because one of the things I think that came very clearly from a lot of things that we heard here, it is very hard and extremely irresponsible to say if you give me this amount of money, I'll give you this amount of outcome. The amount of pressure I was in during all the debates about the school reform, every governmental meeting that dealt with the reform started by saying, how many places will Israel climb the international ladder due to this money? I said, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I think it will. I think we're doing the right thing. I'll explain you why I think we're doing the right thing. I don't know. Because I've read, I think, most reports about educational reforms, and I know that you can set a target, but doesn't mean that you reach the target, and if you set a very high target, you can be sure you won't reach the target. So you should be very careful not to make promises you can't really match, and you should know for yourself and for the system that reaching the target is going to take a long time, and the Ministry of Finance next year is going to ask the same question, and you will have to be very honest and say, not yet, maybe next year we'll be able to evaluate a small change. By the way, every time that I see a major jump in education, I know somebody is cheating. Not teaching, sorry. When you teach, it's a slow process. When you cheat, it works very, very well for a moment. We'll talk about it also later. So, going back to the question, what's the problem we wanted to deal with? I said basic learning skills, allowing children to acquire what I think is absolutely necessary for them to succeed in the future. And every child. Now, as I said, Israel is a heterogeneous society, and we have to take into account the fact that our schools bring in children with very, very different level of reading and writing, very different backgrounds. We have a large population of immigrants, namely their parents are illiterate in the mother tongue of the country, something that puts a lot of emphasis on school. If your parents, even if they're very intelligent and well educated, don't speak Hebrew, they can't help you in school. They can't monitor your homework. They can't teach you something that is being taught in the classroom because they don't have tools to do that. 20% of the children is not a small number, and they come from very different countries, from Leningrad to Ethiopia, and they have very different relationship within the family, something I think we didn't talk about as much here, but I think is now very much discussed, is the family background and the mother's ability to support the children in their learning. We have a very large Arabic-speaking school system, which is confronting the very complicated issues of teaching Arabic. Teaching Arabic, I won't go into it, is a very, very difficult challenge in Israel and in all the Arabic-speaking countries. So literacy, learning skill, is not something trivial. Then we had to decide how to do it. Now, the second thing that I think a Minister of Education should take into account is that he or she are not going to replace the system. Everything that you get is what you have to work with. Because what people tell you, especially when they're not in a position to make a decision, is, change the teachers, bring in new teachers, build new schools. I mean, there are lots of good ideas, but you can't do them, right? Those are the schools, those are the teachers. If I see a system with 180 and 28,000 teachers, I'll be lucky if I replace 10% of them. So you can't replace. You have to work with the teachers you have, with the system you have. If you start waiting until you replace them all, then you won't do anything, especially in Israel, because by that time you'll be out of office. But even in other countries. So don't illude yourself you can replace the system. So your question is even harder. How do you make a change in this system, with these teachers, in the existing schools, with the problems you have? This is what you have to deal with. Our school reform tried to deal with the problem by emphasizing two very important aspects. of a school reform, and in this respect, one is, I think, common to other reforms that were suggested here, and one was unique. The unique part is that we asked ourselves, I think the most important question of all in education, what happens in the classroom? It's not about administration, because the Ministry of Finance and everybody else, all the external advisors, will tell you how to change the administration of the ministry. I'll tell you, it doesn't mean a thing. There is absolutely no importance whether the Ministry of Education in Israel has 7 districts or 2 districts or 5 districts. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many people are doing administrative job in your ministry. It's good that you be very efficient, and we try to be very efficient. And Shlomit Amichai was my general director, did the unbelievable process of making our work really more efficient than ever. But if I should be honest with you, then the fact that we made several hundreds of people redundant didn't change a bit, even didn't change the budget, generally. Okay, we speak about a school reform, about several billion shekels, and we saved 2 million, 5 billion. So, put things in proportion. This is the first thing that you have to do if you want to make a reform. We decided to try and introduce into the Israeli classroom a pedagogical change that is grounded in an assumption that our classes are as they are right now, crowded, heterogeneous, with children of different abilities and different backgrounds. And the question was, how do you help these children be achievers? And the answer we gave is that we should allow them, at least for a fraction of the time, not all the time, work in small groups and get tutorials that will help them overcome their problems. My understanding is that many of the children fail for small problems. They didn't listen in class. They didn't understand. They had some problems that didn't allow them to concentrate at a very crucial moment in their learning. So they need some special help. They need to be supported. But if you are a teacher with 35 or 32 children in a classroom, you can't do that. You can't even notice who has a problem and who hasn't. So it's very good to preach to teachers, you must do that. They can't. So the thing that we wanted to do was to allow teachers to meet their students, to screen children with problems and help them. So part of the school reform, I think a significant part of the school reform, they will have over 100 hours of tutorials a week. Now what can they do with these hours? They can take children that are facing learning difficulties and help them. They can take actually children that would otherwise fall behind and give them support. They can do it, and this is up to the teacher and the head teacher to decide. They can do it for a fraction of the school year or for the whole school year. They can change the group of children. They can take children in different topics to help them and support them. And something that was, for me, very important, they can also take overachieving children out of the classroom and give them some satisfaction, because those children could be a problem too, because they sit in class, they're bored, they're irritated by what is happening around them, and they also need somebody to attend and help them to feel satisfied in school. And an unsatisfied child in school is going to be a problem, whether he's very good or has a lot of learning problems. So we introduced, and the reform of New Horizons is grounded in this change, that we allow teachers to meet their children in small groups, give them educational support, sometimes also emotional support. Don't forget, this is a country during my term, which was rather short, we had an operation in the north, an operation in the south. There were Qassams near schools. The years before, there were buses exploded in Jerusalem. Children come to school. This is not your average regular group of children. Children come to school in Israel with extremely complicated problems, and they bring their problems to school. I know everybody wants to keep the school system out of the Israeli society. Everybody will be rude. In the school, everybody will be polite. Everybody will be violent. In the school, everybody will respect each other. It doesn't work. And all the problems of the Israeli society, immigration, poverty, terrorism, war, they're all in the school system. I sometimes wonder how it works. I should tell you that when I see the outcome, sometimes I'm very irritated and frustrated, and sometimes I say, gosh, it really works. You know, there is a system here. Everybody goes to school. In a system like Israel, with its complexities, it's not a trivial thing. Maybe you should say generally, by the way, about Israel. It's not a trivial thing that the system here works at all. But, you know, children go to school, and we have to deal with their problems. Now, once you make a decision like that, and once you have the ability to support it, both politically, and I should say that in my case, I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister. Without the Prime Minister, I wouldn't have done it, because he understood what I was planning to do, and he gave me the support. The previous, my Prime Minister. Yes, the previous Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert. He gave me the support. He gave me the funding. I'll tell you just an anecdote. The only reason we had a school reform was that there was a very brief moment during the last government that the Prime Minister was also the Minister of Finance. And since he was... Stay the cork. Okay, so I won't tell you the anecdote. Okay. But you got the idea. So let me just say 1 minute about what we did and 1 minute about what shouldn't be done. The 1 minute about what we did is, once you have an idea, you have to do a lot of preparatory work to implement. And here I think Shlomi, with the ministry, implementation is a process. And we've seen it here. You don't have an idea, and you expect that people in the field will understand it and know what to do. It doesn't work. Ministers have this assumption that if they say something, then the field will do it. Nonsense. When you say something, people wait to see what will happen. Maybe you'll go, maybe there'll be another minister, maybe you won't get the money. They wait. So you have to work with it. You have to convince them it's good for the system. You have to convince your own people in the ministry. You have to convince the people in the field. You have to convince the teachers. And when they are convinced, you have to train them. Because a teacher that now is convinced that teaching in small groups is good needs training to do that, because he or she never did it. And they're really frightened, and rightly so, because suddenly they sit with 4 children. They, first of all, discover that they don't know what they assumed they knew. Second, they discover is they don't know it for different reasons. So they can't really have one strategy to work with 4 children. They have to have 4 strategies to work with 4 children. And that takes time and preparation. So it's very complicated. And on top of that, one of the children quietly says to the teacher that his parents are quarreling and he's exposed to violence at home. And the teacher is frightened because now she has that information and she has to do something with it. So, you know, if I had more time, I would talk more about it. But working with the teachers in order to do it, and it's a good thing we did it with the union. Without them, we couldn't have done it. But this is a process. And I'm very sorry to hear now that the new minister, they are adopting the reform, but they're not taking it to heart. I mean, school reforms, in order to work, need somebody that cares for them, like babies. Yeah? You have to work with it. You have to bear the frustration. You have to change what needs to be changed, because from your idea to the field, lots of things happen. And it's good. I mean, it's not because you were wrong. You shouldn't be frightened because somebody tells you it doesn't work in the field. It doesn't work in the field, so you have to change it. Doesn't mean that it's bad. And you have to keep on going, and you have to keep on pursuing it, and I'm not sure it's going to happen. The one thing I would say very clearly shouldn't be done now is to try and get quick results. And I resisted it, as I said, giving this assurance to the government because I think it's fake that we can jump ahead. I think that Israel should not be preparing students for the international exams. Only that group that is attending next year exams or the exams in 2 years ahead, I think, in order to feel we are doing better. It's not about feeling. It's not about pretense. It's not about showing the world that we can do better. It's about being better. And being better takes time. And if you are unable to bear, and if I'll tell you, it's a sad personal story. It's really hard to be a Minister of Education when you want to work for the long term. Because every morning somebody says to you, well, you know, nothing happens. I remember Yossi and I in our first negotiations started sitting, we sat for about 6 or 8 hours, and when we ended the meeting, the press asked me what happened. I said, nothing. Nothing. It started. It took us, by the way, 18, and we worked very well together. It took us 18 months to have an agreement. And the press in the morning, the headline said, first failure, you know. Negotiations ended with nothing. So, you know, you have to convince people. I think, by the way, this is the most important message that should come out of this conference. If you are not patient, you're not an educator. And if you're not an educator, you're bound to do something wrong. Thank you.
We have only 6 minutes. So, 2 or 3 questions shortly. Short question, if you want to know the answer.
The baseline is the learning gain that's occurring during the academic year, because we were doing fall, spring assessments of students. So the baseline is how much learning was occurring during the academic year prior to the introduction of professional coaching.
First grade.
Oh, it was a continuous metric of literacy learning from kindergarten through grade 3 that we built out of a set of subtasks.
So the baseline actually changed probably.
Well, it was a continuous developmental scale so that we could measure at each grade level what the baseline learning gains were. I just summarized them across the 4 grades for the purposes of that display. In the particular initiative I was talking about, that is where the coaches came from. They were teachers in the school who received the better part of a year of professional development to go from teachers of children to teachers of adults. That is, to take on the coaching role. And then they went back and then they continued in their school in that role as a professional developer. So they were of the form that you described. And that can be a resource if that teacher is well connected in the social network of a school. Because what our research has shown is that in the schools where this initiative has really worked, the coach has really become central to the professional development network among the teachers. And when it's failed, the coach has remained at the periphery. Hasn't really been seen as a resource by the other teachers.
Thank you.
Yes. תן לי מילה ליולי תמיר.
אוקיי, בקצר.
שר חינוך מספר 7,
כן.
16 או משהו כזה.
יולי, אני שואל אותך. אוקיי.
אני צריך להגיד לך שבתקופה הקצרה שלך היו לך 2 הישגים גדולים. א', בלם את קיצוצי התקציב שלא הייתה להם הצדקה. ב', התחלת רפורמה שבהחלט מכוונת לעזור לתלמידים החלשים בכיתות הפרטניות, וזה אני מחשיב יותר על מעט.
אני מבין שאלה לא שאלות. כן.
אבל יחד עם זה, אין ברירה לשר חינוך, אלא לעסוק בכל ההיבטים של המערכת. וזה לא אחד על חשבון השני. שיפור רמת הכשרת המורים זה אפשר לעשות גם כשעוסקים ברפורמה בתוך בתי הספר. תוכניות לימודים יחד עם האוניברסיטאות, להביא את המדע המעודכן ביותר, זה לא במקום המאמץ.
תודה רבה אדוני, אנחנו צריכים עוד שאלה וזהו, אנחנו מסיימים.
בעיקר כששרים מחלפים מהר, הם חייבים לעשות זאת.
אוקיי. Yes, and
I have a question for Professor Bryk. We've been talking about...
Excuse me? סליחה? Yes.
We've been, for Professor Bryk, we've been talking about policy and practice for 3 days. And Professor Bryk introduced a new term into the conversation today, which was an instructional system. And we haven't heard that up till now. So I wanted to ask him again to say why he finds that to be important to his thinking, and maybe a little bit about what counts as an instructional system, and how that might even guide the thinking of policymakers and reformers and people involved in trying to improve teaching.
Thank you. And maybe, yes.
I have a question similar to that. In the United States, and certainly in New York, where you come from, we used to have assistant principals on subject areas in each of the high schools, which essentially was a coach. And we just talk about the issue of an instructional system and someone who is out there in the trenches working to guide teachers. There is a role called an assistant principal. As you know, the principal was the lead teacher. This is the assistant lead teacher in each of the subject areas. I say to you, what makes that person and that title different from the coach that is being discussed here?
Thank you. Yes.
All right, well, so let's see, I think there's a few different questions on the floor. On the issue of an instructional system, in very gross terms, it's the sequence of learning. It starts with the sequence of learning goals. What is it we want students to learn, and how are those arranged over time? It involves formative assessments. How do we know whether or not our students are learning and learning to adequate levels what it is, what that sequence of learning goals is? It's a set of routines. It's what are the set of common pedagogical practices that teachers need to know and be able to execute in order to advance that learning. So in the context of comprehensive literacy, it was those six basic ways of organizing instruction: guided reading, interactive writing, and so on. And then it's a set of professional development resources to support teachers to accomplish that. That work within a system like that creates the basis for community among teachers, and it also then creates the basis for thinking about how system policies might be structured to support improvements in that. If you don't have that at the core, it's very hard to figure out what you do at a system center is supposed to actually improve teaching and learning. On the question of the assistant principals in New York, I don't know enough about how they were selected, how they were trained, how the role was defined, and how it was enacted. In fact, that's precisely what this analysis was supposed to be about, because in the United States this became a silver bullet reform. Lots of districts suddenly decided they were going to introduce coaches, and it's not simply the fact that you've got one. It's a question of, well, what is the work they're supposed to do? And then that in turn leads you to the question of, what is it that they need to know in order to be able to do this? How do we know whether or not they can do it? And how do we build the support systems for them to enact that role? So this is capacity building at every level. In this case, it would be capacity building around supporting the coaches.
Thank you very much. פרופסור תמיר, זכות התגובה לחצי דקה גם למחמאות.
רק לאהרון, באופן עקרוני לא, אתה צודק כמובן. אמרתי, שר חינוך מטפל בהרבה נושאים, הוא רק צריך להחליט איפה הוא מתמקד. ושאלת המיקוד, כמו שאתה יודע, היא מאוד מאוד קשה, כי כמות הדרישות שבאות לפתחך היא עצומה. וכמובן שטיפלנו גם בדברים אחרים, אבל הדבר שחשוב לי להגיד אותו, הוא שמבחינת הרפורמה, אל תוך הרפורמה שעשינו, השתלבו נושאים של הכשרת מורים. השתלב בית הספר למנהלים עם קואוצ'ינג של מנהלים, שהיה דבר מאוד מאוד משמעותי, של in-service training, פעם ראשונה. השתלבו כמובן מסלולי קידום שבנויים על הכשרה מקצועית ועוד ועוד ועוד. אז עכשיו דיברתי על פן מאוד קצר של הרפורמה, אבל לפני שעזבתי הראו לי ספר כזה של כל ההיבטים של הרפורמה, כולל איך נראה החדר שבו מורה עובד עם התלמיד, זאת אומרת זה מהבינוי ועד הכשרת מורים, דרך העבודה עם המכללות, וכמובן כל הדברים הללו, כך שגם הרפורמה עצמה נשמעת צרה, אבל היא הייתה בעלת היקף מאוד רחב, וכל היתר גם בו צריך לטפל.
תודה רבה. אני מאוד מודה לשני האורחים, לפרופסור ברייק, thank you very much, and למדע את הכנסת.